Two wealthy women pointed and laughed at the caregiver at the charity gala. What they didn't know was that the most powerful man in the room was watching everything in silence, and his next decision would change that night forever. The ballroom of the Hartwell Grand Hotel sparkled, as if every chandelier had been polished by angels. Crystal fixtures scattered golden light across tables dressed in white roses and flickering candles. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided between guests, offering champagne in glasses that cost more than Margaret Sullivan earned in a week of caring for the elderly. Margaret should not have been there. At 57, she had spent 3 decades bathing frail bodies, spooning soup into trembling mouths, and holding the hands of people as they took their final breaths. Her own hands, weathered by years of lifting patients and changing soiled sheets, had comforted hundreds of families during their darkest hours, yet those same families forgot her name the moment the funeral ended. They would send flowers to the facility, never to her. They would write thank you cards addressed to the staff, never to Margaret Sullivan, the woman who had sung their mother to sleep or held their father's hand through the long, frightening nights. She had always been invisible, the woman who arrived before dawn and left after dark, the one who knew every medication by heart but was never invited to sit at the dinner table, the help. Tonight, however, fate had conspired to drag her from the shadows. It all started 6 weeks ago, when a silver Cadillac pulled up to Sunrise Meadows, assisted living facility where Margaret worked the overnight shift. Victoria Ashford stepped out as if the parking lot were contaminated, designer heels barely touching the cracked asphalt, before she rushed toward the entrance with an expression of barely concealed disgust. Victoria was married to Charles Ashford, one of the wealthiest real estate developers on the East Coast. She was known in society circles for her lavish parties, her stunning wardrobes, and her ability to destroy a person's reputation with a single well-placed comment at the country club. Women wanted to be her, men wanted to impress her, and everyone, without exception, wanted to stay on her good side. That night, Victoria's father had suffered a massive stroke, the kind that steals everything in an instant. For 3 weeks, Margaret became the primary caregiver for Harold Whitmore, a 79-year-old man who had built an empire from nothing. Starting as a carpenter's apprentice in rural Ohio, he ended up owning commercial real estate in 3 states. The stroke had stolen his speech and mobility, but not his understanding. Those pale blue eyes watched everything, comprehended everything, even when his mouth could not form the words. Margaret talked to him anyway, while adjusting pillows and changing his sheets. She told him about her daughter Sarah in Seattle, who called every Sunday without fail, about her late husband Jim, a high school English teacher who died of cancer 15 years ago, leaving medical debt she was still paying off, about her small apartment above the laundromat on Maple Street, where the smell of fabric softener seeped through the floorboards and reminded her of summers at her grandmother's house. She sang to Harold during baths, old hymns her mother had taught her in the kitchen of their farmhouse, songs about grace and redemption that seemed to calm his restless hands. His eyes would close peacefully during Amazing Grace, his breathing steadying during How Great Thou Art. Sometimes she caught what looked like the ghost of a smile crossing his frozen features. Victoria visited rarely, never staying more than 10 minutes. She would stand in the doorway checking her phone, asking if he was improving, never actually looking at her father, never touching him, never speaking to him directly. One evening after Victoria left without so much as a goodbye, Harold's hand found Margaret's wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong, and his eyes were filled with something that looked like gratitude mixed with profound sadness. A single tear rolled down his weathered cheek, disappearing into the white stubble on his jaw. "I know," Margaret whispered, squeezing his hand gently. "You're not alone, I'm right here." The next morning, Harold Whitmore passed away in his sleep, with Margaret's hand wrapped around his. Victoria arrived 2 hours later, her grief controlled like everything else about her. Her eyes were dry. Her makeup was perfect. After signing papers, she approached Margaret in the hallway. "You were with him when he died?" "Yes, ma'am." I held his hand. He went peacefully. Victoria studied Margaret's face, then reached into her designer bag and pulled out an envelope. "I'm hosting a charity gala next month at the Hartwell Grand, a memorial tribute for my father supporting the Children's Hospital Foundation." She pressed the envelope into Margaret's hands. "Come as my guest. I'm giving you a $5,000 bonus for your dedication. Pick it up at the gala." $5,000. Margaret's mind raced with possibilities. Her car had broken down last month and she had been taking 3 buses to get to work. Her daughter's wedding was approaching in spring, and Margaret had promised to help with the expenses. The apartment roof leaked every time it rained, and her landlord kept making promises he never kept. I don't know what to say. Say you'll come. Wear something nice, it's black tie. Margaret owned exactly 3 dresses, one for church, one for funerals, and her mother's simple navy dress with small white flowers that still smelled faintly of lavender after 30 years. She had it altered by a seamstress friend who owed her a favor, found heels at the thrift store that only pinched a little, borrowed a small clutch from her neighbor Eleanor. "Ah, you look beautiful," Elena had said, "like Grace Kelly in those old movies." I look like a caregiver trying not to look like a caregiver. Now, standing at the ballroom entrance, Margaret felt anything but royalty. The women around her dripped with diamonds that caught the chandelier light and scattered it like fallen stars. Their gowns cost more than her annual salary. Their faces were smooth, preserved by treatments from a world completely foreign to hers. She clutched the borrowed purse against her stomach and forced herself to breathe. Get the check, say thank you, leave. Simple. Nothing about what happened next was simple. She made her way through the crowd, acutely aware of the glances following her progress, not welcoming looks. These were the stares of people who smelled an outsider, the way sharks scented blood. Eyebrows raised, lips curled into smirks. Whispered conversations halted abruptly when she walked past, only to resume the moment she was 3 steps away. A waiter carrying champagne looked directly at Margaret, held her gaze for a heartbeat, then turned and walked the opposite direction. She pretended not to notice. A massive portrait of Harold Whitmore hung behind the stage. In it he was young, maybe 40, wearing a sharp suit and a confident smile. Nothing like the frail man she had cared for, but those eyes were the same, watchful, kind beneath all the business toughness. "You deserved better," she whispered to the portrait. "Excuse me?" Margaret spun to find a woman in an emerald green gown staring with undisguised hostility. "I knew Mr. Whitmore. I was his caregiver at Sunrise Meadows." The woman's expression shifted to amusement. "Victoria invited the help to her father's memorial. How very modern." She disappeared into a cluster of socialites whispering behind manicured hands. Margaret caught fragments. "Thrift store," and "probably crashed the party." Her cheeks burned with shame. She should leave, forget about the money and go home. But $5,000, Sarah's wedding, the car, the leaking roof. She stayed. It took 20 minutes to locate Victoria near the silent auction tables, surrounded by women stamped from the same mold of expensive sameness. At Victoria's side stood another woman, younger by a decade, with sharp cheekbones and sharper eyes. She held her champagne glass like a weapon. "Mrs. Ashford?" Margaret's voice came out smaller than intended. "I'm Margaret Sullivan. You invited me." Victoria turned slowly. Her face was completely blank. No recognition, no memory. Then something flickered, something like satisfaction. "Margaret, the woman who held my father's hand, how touching you came. You said there would be a check, the bonus." "Did I?" Victoria tilted her head. "Brooke, did I mention a check?" Brooke pressed a hand to her chest. "A check? You invited this woman to the social event of the season and she's asking for money." Nearby heads turned. Conversations paused. Eyes locked onto Margaret with undisguised curiosity. "There must be a misunderstanding." Margaret fought to keep steady. "You said $5,000. Victoria's laugh was musical and cutting. "Sweetheart, the only thing in that envelope was the invitation. Consider it a cultural experience. But you said you were compensated through the facility's rates." "Please," the word scraped out. "My daughter is getting married. I promised to help." "Your daughter's wedding?" Brooke dripped false sympathy. "What is she, a checkout girl marrying one of the bag boys?" Women nearby laughed, ice cracking. "My daughter is a physical therapist. She helps disabled children learn to walk." "How noble." "Unfortunately, there is no check. There was never going to be one." Margaret felt the floor tilt. "Then why invite me?" Something ugly crossed Victoria's face. "Because my father liked you." Bitter and clipped. "His final weeks, all he wanted was you. He grabbed your hand and pushed mine away. He calmed when you sang, became agitated when I visited. My own father, preferring someone paid to care for him." The truth struck Margaret physically. This was never about money. This was revenge. "You showed up at my father's deathbed and made me the villain." Victoria's voice was low and precise. Everyone at that facility looked at me like a monster because the help had a better relationship with my father than I did. He loved you. He was scared. Don't. You spent 3 weeks with him. I spent 50 years. 50 years of absence, Margaret thought. 50 years of missed holidays and visits that never happened. I'm sorry you feel that way. I only tried giving him comfort. Here's comfort for you. Victoria straightened, diamonds glittering. You don't belong here. Take your thrift store dress and borrowed purse back to wherever people like you come from. People like me? The invisible ones. Every nearby eye locked onto Margaret. Expressions ranged from embarrassed to entertained. No one intervened. Brooke leaned toward another woman. I thought this was a charity gala, not a soup kitchen. Cruel, collective laughter. Margaret's vision blurred with tears she refused to shed. Her mother always said, "Never let them see you cry." I'll leave, but first, I want you to know something about your father. Victoria rolled her eyes. The last word he spoke before the stroke was your name. Victoria. Over and over during his first night like a prayer. Victoria's face flickered. Something cracked beneath the porcelain facade. He never stopped loving you. Even when you couldn't be there, he kept a photograph on his nightstand. You as a little girl on his shoulders at some beach. He touched it every morning. The ballroom had gone quiet. Conversations stilled. Heads turned. He forgave you. For the distance, the absence, the anger. Because that's what fathers do. Margaret's tears finally spilled, but her voice stayed strong. His last breath was peaceful. He believed in you. Victoria said nothing. Her mouth formed a thin line. I don't need your money. I have something worth more. A clear conscience. A daughter who loves me. The memory of a good man who died knowing he wasn't alone. She turned to leave. Wait. The voice came from behind Victoria. Deep, authoritative, commanding. Margaret stopped, turned slowly, and found herself looking into the most striking pair of grey eyes she had ever seen. The man standing before Margaret was tall, with silver hair that swept back from a face weathered by time, but still striking in its intensity. He wore his tuxedo like a second skin, comfortable in a way that spoke of decades attending events exactly like this one, but it was his eyes that held her attention. Grey as storm clouds, sharp as broken glass, and filled with something she could not immediately name. I believe, he said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence, that this woman was invited here as a guest, not as entertainment for the bored and the cruel. Victoria's face went pale beneath her flawless makeup. Richard, I didn't realize you were listening? He arched one silver eyebrow. I've been listening to quite a lot this evening, Victoria, including your rather creative interpretation of what happened with your father's care. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Margaret noticed several people exchanging glances, and somewhere behind her she heard someone whisper, "That's Richard Calloway." The Richard Calloway. The name meant nothing to Margaret, but from the way Victoria's confident posture crumbled slightly, from the way Brooke suddenly found her champagne glass fascinating, she understood that this man wielded power the way others wielded money, effortlessly and absolutely. "This is a private conversation," Victoria managed, her voice losing some of its earlier venom. "In the middle of a ballroom with 300 guests?" Richard's smile held no warmth. "I think we both know that's not true. What is true is that I knew your father for 42 years. We built our first buildings together, back when neither of us had 2 nickels to rub together, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that Harold would be ashamed of what just happened here." Victoria's jaw tightened. "You don't know what—" "I know that Harold called me 3 days before his stroke." Richard's voice softened slightly, taking on the texture of memory. "He told me he was worried about dying alone, not because he didn't have family, but because his family had become strangers. He said the only person who made him feel like himself anymore was a caregiver at the facility, a woman who sang hymns and held his hand and talked to him like he was still a human being." Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. "He said her name was Margaret." Richard turned those storm-grey eyes toward her. "He said she reminded him of his late wife, kind without expecting anything in return, patient when patience was hard, present when presence mattered most." The ballroom had gone completely still. Even the string quartet had stopped playing, the musicians watching the scene unfold with undisguised fascination. "Harold asked me to do something for him," Richard continued. "He asked me to make sure that if anything happened to him, this woman would be taken care of. He knew Victoria wouldn't do it. He knew because Victoria hadn't done anything for him in years that didn't come with a photo opportunity attached. "That's not fair," Victoria whispered, but her voice had lost all its edge. "Fair?" Richard shook his head slowly. "You want to talk about fair? Your father built everything you have. Every diamond on your wrist, every designer dress in your closet, every vacation home and country club membership. He gave you everything, Victoria. And in return you gave him 10-minute visits where you couldn't even look at his face." "I was busy," Victoria said. "I have responsibilities." "We're all busy. We all have responsibilities." Richard's voice was quiet but relentless. "I run a company with 12,000 employees. I sit on the boards of 7 charities. I have grandchildren in 3 different states. And I still found time to visit Harold twice a week, every week, for the past 5 years." Margaret saw something break behind Victoria's eyes. Not anger, something deeper, something that looked almost like grief, finally fighting its way to the surface. "I tried," Victoria said, and for the first time her voice cracked. "When I was younger, I tried, but he was always working, always building something. He missed my graduation, my wedding, the birth of my children. He was never there when I needed him, so I stopped needing him." The words hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Richard was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had gentled. "I know Harold wasn't a perfect father. He was driven, obsessive about his work, often absent when he should have been present. He carried guilt about that until the day he died. But Victoria, punishing a dying man for the sins of your childhood isn't justice. It's just more pain piled on top of old pain." Victoria's eyes glistened with tears. She was clearly fighting to control. Brooke reached out to touch her arm, but Victoria pulled away. "And attacking this woman?" Richard gestured toward Margaret. "Humiliating her in public because your father loved her kindness in his final days. That's not about Harold at all. That's about you not being able to forgive yourself for the years you wasted." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret stood frozen, unsure what to do, unsure what was expected of her. She had come here for money she desperately needed, and instead found herself in the middle of a family reckoning decades in the making. Victoria took a shuddering breath, then another. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this." It wasn't an apology, it wasn't an admission of guilt, but it was something Margaret hadn't expected to hear. Honesty. Richard nodded slowly. "That's the first true thing you've said all night." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope. "This is what your father left for Margaret. He asked me to deliver it personally because he didn't trust you to do it." He held the envelope out to Margaret. Her hands trembled as she took it. "Harold wanted you to have this. He said you were the only one who made his last weeks bearable, the only one who saw him as a person, not a patient or a burden or a source of inheritance." Margaret looked down at the envelope. Her name was written on the front in shaky handwriting. Harold's handwriting, she realized. He must have written it before the stroke when he could still control a pen. "I can't," she whispered. "I was just doing my job." "No." Richard shook his head firmly. "You were doing far more than your job. I visited Harold 3 days before he died. Do you know what he told me? He said that when you sang to him, he could hear his mother's voice. She used to sing those same hymns when he was a boy in Ohio. He said you gave him back something he thought he'd lost forever." Margaret's tears fell freely now. She didn't try to stop them. "He also told me something else," Richard continued. "He said you talked about your daughter, about how proud you were of her, how she helps children learn to walk again. He said listening to you talk about Sarah made him realize what he'd missed with Victoria." Margaret pressed the envelope against her heart. "He was a good man. Scared and lonely, but good. I could see it in his eyes." "Yes." Richard smiled, and for the first time there was genuine warmth in it. He was, flawed like all of us, but good at his core. He turned to face the crowd, raising his voice to carry across the ballroom. "I want everyone here to understand something. This woman, Margaret Sullivan, represents everything this charity gala is supposed to celebrate. Compassion, service, human dignity. She spent 30 years caring for people at their most vulnerable, asking nothing in return except fair wages for honest work." He paused, letting the words settle. "She came here tonight because she was promised money she needed. Money for her daughter's wedding, money to fix her car so she could keep getting to work, money to repair a leaking roof. Basic things that most of us in this room never have to worry about." Margaret felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes on her, but somehow it felt different now. less hostile, more curious, perhaps even sympathetic. Instead of that money, she got mockery, cruelty, public humiliation from people who have never worked a hard day in their privileged lives. Richard's voice hardened again. I've spent 60 years building a fortune, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that money means nothing if you use it to destroy rather than uplift. Wealth without compassion is just emptiness wearing expensive clothes. Brooke had shrunk back into the crowd, her champagne glass abandoned on a nearby table. Several women who had been laughing earlier were now studying their shoes with intense concentration. So here's what's going to happen, Richard announced. I'm going to take Margaret to dinner, a real dinner where people treat each other with respect. And tomorrow, I'm going to make sure she has everything she needs. Not because Harold asked me to, though he did, but because it's the right thing to do. He offered Margaret his arm. She stared at it for a long moment. This gesture of old-fashioned courtesy from a man who seemed to belong to a different era entirely. An era when honor meant something, when a man's word was his bond, when kindness was not a weakness, but a strength. I don't understand, she said softly. You don't even know me. Richard smiled again, and this time his eyes crinkled at the corners with genuine warmth. I know enough. I know that you held my friend's hand when he was dying. I know that you sang hymns that brought him peace. I know that you treated him with dignity when his own daughter couldn't bear to look at him. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are. Margaret hesitated. Part of her wanted to refuse to maintain her independence. But another part, the part that had been carrying burdens alone for 15 years, that had buried a husband and raised a daughter and cared for countless strangers, that part was exhausted. Okay, she heard herself say. She took Richard Calloway's arm. As they walked toward the exit, Margaret caught a glimpse of Victoria standing alone. Brooke had melted into the crowd. The women who surrounded her earlier had drifted away. Victoria looked smaller, diminished, stripped of the armor she had worn so confidently. And despite everything, Margaret felt something unexpected stir in her chest. Not anger, not satisfaction, pity. Because she recognized that look. She had seen it on the faces of countless family members over the years. The look of someone who had waited too long to say the things that mattered, and now had to live with that silence forever. Just before she reached the door, Margaret stopped. Wait, she said to Richard. Please, just one moment. She walked back to where Victoria stood alone, surrounded by empty space where admirers had clustered just moments before. Up close, Margaret could see that Victoria's mascara had smudged slightly, that her hands were trembling, that beneath the diamonds and the designer dress was a woman drowning in regret. Mrs. Ashford, Margaret said quietly, so only Victoria could hear. Your father didn't die angry at you. He died hoping that someday you would understand, that you would forgive him for his failures, and forgive yourself for yours. That's why he kept touching your photograph every morning. Not to remember what he lost, but to hold on to what he still believed was possible. Victoria's carefully constructed mask finally shattered. Tears spilled down her cheeks, cutting tracks through her perfect makeup. I wasted so much time, she whispered. Time you wasted is gone, Margaret said gently. But you still have time left. Use it differently. That's the only thing any of us can do. She turned and walked back to Richard, who was watching with an expression of quiet respect. Together they stepped out of the glittering ballroom and into the cool night air. Behind them, Victoria Ashford sank into a chair and, for the first time in 40 years, let herself truly grieve for her father. The restaurant Richard chose was nothing like Margaret had expected. No crystal chandeliers, no waiters in tuxedos, no champagne in glasses that cost a week's wages. Instead, he drove them to a small Italian place tucked between a dry cleaner and a hardware store on the outskirts of the city. The sign above the door read, Lucia's, in faded red letters, and the windows glowed warm and golden in the cool night air. This was Harold's favorite restaurant, Richard explained, as he held the door open for her. We came here every Thursday for 20 years. Same booth, same order. Lucia made the best chicken parmesan either of us ever tasted. The inside was exactly what the outside promised. Simple wooden tables covered in checkered cloths, candles in old wine bottles dripping wax, and the rich smell of garlic and tomatoes filling every corner. An elderly woman with silver hair piled high on her head looked up from behind the counter, and her face split into a wide smile. Ricardo, where have you been? 3 weeks without my meatballs. You're going to waste away to nothing. Richard kissed her on both cheeks. "Lucia, I want you to meet someone special. This is Margaret. She was with Harold when he passed." Lucia's smile softened into something tender and sad. "Ah, Harold, God rest his soul. Such a good man, always tipping too much and pretending he couldn't taste the difference when I ran out of fresh basil." She took Margaret's hands in her own, papery and warm. "You were with him at the end?" "Yes, Ma'am. I held his hand." "Then you did what his own daughter couldn't do. Come, come, I give you the good table, Harold's table. And tonight you eat for free. Anyone who gave my friend comfort in his last days deserves that much." She led them to a booth in the corner, away from the few other diners scattered throughout the restaurant. The leather seats were worn smooth from decades of use, and someone had carved initials into the wooden table edge, HW plus LC. "Harold and Lucia's husband, Carlo," Richard explained, noticing where Margaret's eyes had landed. "They carved that 40 years ago, back when none of us had anything. Carlo died about 15 years back. Heart attack, same as your husband, if I remember correctly." Margaret nodded, running her fingers over the carved letters. 15 years this past March. Jim was grading papers when it happened. They found him at his desk with a red pen still in his hand. A teacher? High school English. He loved it. Loved the kids, loved the books, loved standing in front of a classroom and watching the moment when something finally clicked for a struggling student. She smiled at the memory. He used to say that teaching was the only profession where you could change the world one teenager at a time. Richard was quiet for a moment, studying her face with those perceptive grey eyes. "Harold told me you raised your daughter alone after he died. Put her through college working double shifts. Sarah earned scholarships for most of it. I just filled in the gaps." "Don't do that," Richard said gently. "Don't minimize what you accomplished. I've seen the resumes of trust fund children who never had to work a day in their lives, and I've seen the resumes of people who clawed their way up from nothing. I'll take the second group every time. They understand something the first group never will." "What's that?" "That nothing worth having comes easy, and that the struggle is what makes the victory sweet." Lucia returned with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "The good stuff," she announced, "from Carlo's private collection. He would want Harold's friends to drink it." When she left, Richard poured for both of them and raised his glass. "To Harold, to Carlo, and to Jim. Good men who left too soon." Margaret touched her glass to his. The wine was rich and smooth, nothing like the cheap bottles she bought on sale at the grocery store. It tasted like someone's life's work, like years of careful attention and patience. "The envelope," she said suddenly, remembering. "Harold's letter. I still haven't opened it." She pulled it from her borrowed purse, the paper slightly crumpled now from being pressed against her heart. Her name stared up at her in Harold's shaky handwriting. "Take your time," Richard said. "There's no rush." Margaret's hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside were 2 pieces of paper. The first was a letter, handwritten and short. The second was a check. She read the letter first, her lips moving silently. "Dear Margaret, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I wanted to thank you for everything you did for me in my final weeks. Not the bathing and feeding, though I am grateful for that too, but for seeing me, for treating me like Harold instead of like a dying old man. I have made many mistakes in my life. I worked too hard and loved too little. I built an empire and lost a daughter in the process. Victoria's anger at me is justified, even if her cruelty to you is not. I am leaving you something to help with the things you mentioned during our conversations. Your car, your daughter's wedding, the leaking roof. These are small problems for me, but enormous ones for you, and if my money can ease your burdens even slightly, it will have served a better purpose than anything else I ever did with it. Please don't feel guilty for accepting this gift. You earned it, not through work, but through kindness, through humanity, through being the person I wish my own daughter could have been. Tell Sarah I said congratulations on her wedding. Tell her that her mother is a remarkable woman who deserves all the happiness in the world, and if you ever think of me, remember this. You made a lonely old man feel less alone. That is worth more than any amount of money." With gratitude and affection, Harold Whitmore. Margaret's tears fell onto the paper, smudging Harold's already shaky handwriting. She looked at the check and her breath stopped. $100,000. "That's not possible," she whispered. Richard leaned forward. "What does it say?" $100,000. "There must be a mistake. This is too much. I can't accept this." "There's no mistake." Richard's voice was calm and certain. "Harold discussed this with me before his stroke. He wanted to give you more, actually. I talked him down to a reasonable amount. A reasonable... Margaret couldn't finish the sentence. Her mind reeled with the implications. $100,000. Enough to pay off her car repairs, help with Sarah's wedding, fix the roof, pay down her medical debt and still have money left over. Enough to change everything. I can't, she said again, shaking her head. This isn't right. I was just doing my job. You keep saying that. Richard reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. His palm was warm and steady. But we both know it's not true. You went beyond your job every single day. You sang to him. You talked to him. You held his hand when his own daughter couldn't bear to touch him. That's not a job, Margaret. That's a calling. But I didn't do it for money. And that's exactly why you deserve it. Richard squeezed her hand gently. Harold spent his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Investors, business partners, even family members. Everyone had an angle. Everyone wanted a piece of what he built. And then you came along wanting nothing except to make his final days comfortable. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How precious? Margaret stared at the check through blurry eyes. What am I supposed to do with all this? Whatever you want. Pay your bills. Help your daughter. Take a vacation. Put it in savings for a rainy day. It's yours free and clear, no strings attached. No strings. Lucia arrived with plates of food, chicken parmesan just as Richard had promised, along with fresh bread and a salad dressed in olive oil and lemon. She took one look at Margaret's tear-stained face and the check in her hands and nodded sagely. Harold, she said simply. He was always doing things like this. One time he paid for my nephew's college, and the boy didn't even know where the money came from until Harold was gone. That's the kind of man he was. Generous in secret. Kind when no one was watching. She patted Margaret's shoulder and returned to the kitchen. Eat, Richard urged. You'll feel better with food in you. Margaret picked up her fork, though she barely tasted the meal. Her mind kept circling back to the letter, to Harold's words about mistakes and regrets, and Victoria's justified anger. She thought about all the patients she had cared for over the years, all the complicated family dynamics she had witnessed from the periphery, the children who visited every day and those who never came at all, the spouses who held on until the very end, and those who had checked out years before the death certificate made it official. Richard, she said finally, what really happened between Harold and Victoria? Richard set down his fork and was quiet for a long moment. It's not my story to tell entirely, but I can give you the broad strokes since you're now part of it whether you wanted to be or not. He took a sip of wine before continuing. Harold was a self-made man in the truest sense. Grew up poor in Ohio, father abandoned the family when he was 8, mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. He learned early that the only person he could rely on was himself. That made him successful in business, but emotionally unavailable to the people who loved him. Victoria grew up wealthy but lonely. Harold was always working, chasing the next deal. Her mother died when Victoria was 12. Car accident, very sudden. Victoria needed her father more than ever, and Harold buried himself deeper in work. His way of coping with grief, but to Victoria, it felt like abandonment. She became angry, resentful. She married Charles partly because he was the opposite of Harold, present, attentive. But she never dealt with her rage, never worked through it. As years passed, that rage calcified into something cold and brittle. Margaret nodded slowly. So, when Harold got sick, all that unresolved pain came flooding to the surface. Victoria couldn't handle seeing her father vulnerable because she had spent 40 years pretending he didn't exist. And when she saw you giving him the emotional care she couldn't provide, something in her snapped. That doesn't excuse what she did to me. No, it doesn't. Richard's eyes were steady on hers. Understanding someone's pain doesn't mean accepting their cruelty. Victoria made a choice tonight, a choice to hurt you, to humiliate you publicly, to deny you money you were promised. Those choices have consequences, regardless of her childhood wounds. Margaret looked down at the check again. $100,000, Harold's final gift, his way of setting something right in a life full of wrongs. I'm going to accept it, she said quietly. Good, but I'm also going to do something else. She met Richard's eyes with a newfound resolve. I'm going to write Victoria a letter. Not to forgive her, I'm not there yet, but to tell her what I told her tonight, that it's not too late, that she still has time to be different. Richard smiled, and this time his whole face warmed with it. Harold was right about you. Right about what? He said you had a generous heart, That even when people hurt you, you looked for the pain behind the cruelty. He said the world needed more people like you. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. I'm just a caregiver. You're far more than that. Richard raised his glass again. To new beginnings. Margaret raised hers to meet his. Outside, the night had grown deeper, and somewhere across the city, Victoria Ashford sat alone in her empty mansion, holding her father's photograph and wondering if it really was too late to change. 3 weeks after the gala, Margaret sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside her and a blank sheet of paper staring up from the surface. Through the window, morning light filtered through curtains she had sewn herself 15 years ago, back when Jim was still alive and they had more time than money. The apartment looked different now. The ceiling no longer bore the water stains from the leaking roof that had been fixed within days of depositing Harold's check. A new car sat in the parking lot below, nothing fancy, just a reliable sedan that started every time she turned the key. And on the refrigerator, held in place by a magnet from Sarah's physical therapy clinic, was an invitation to a wedding that Margaret could now help pay for without choosing between her daughter's happiness and her own electricity bill. Everything had changed, and nothing had changed. She was still Margaret Sullivan, caregiver, hymn singer, holder of hands in the dark. The money hadn't altered who she was at her core. It had simply removed obstacles that had been weighing her down for years. But there was still one thing left undone. The letter to Victoria. She had been putting it off for weeks, unsure what to say, unsure if anything she said would matter. Richard had called twice to check on her, and both times she had admitted she hadn't written it yet. Both times he had told her to take her time, that some things couldn't be rushed, but this morning something felt different. Maybe it was the quality of the light coming through the window. Maybe it was the phone call she'd had with Sarah last night, listening to her daughter's excited chatter about wedding plans and color schemes, and whether the venue would allow sparklers during the first dance. Maybe it was simply that enough time had passed for the anger to settle into something more manageable. Margaret picked up her pen and began to write. Dear Victoria, I have started this letter 6 times and thrown away each attempt. I'm not a writer. I never went to college, never learned the proper way to put feelings into words. But I'm going to try anyway, because I think there are things that need to be said, and a letter feels safer than a phone call or a face-to-face conversation. First, I want you to know that I received your father's gift. The money he left for me will change my life in ways I'm still trying to understand. I can help my daughter with her wedding. I can fix the things in my life that have been broken for too long. I can breathe a little easier. And for a woman who has spent 30 years holding her breath, that means more than I can express. But I'm not writing to thank you because you had nothing to do with that gift. I'm writing because of what happened at the gala and because of what I saw in your eyes when I walked away. I saw pain, Victoria. Old pain, buried deep, the kind that hardens into anger when we don't know what else to do with it. I recognized it because I have carried my own version of that pain for most of my life. When my husband died, I was furious. Not just sad, furious. At the doctors who couldn't save him. At the God who took him too soon. At Jim himself for leaving me alone with a daughter to raise and bills to pay, and a future that suddenly looked nothing like what we had planned together. I carried that fury for years, letting it poison my relationships and my peace of mind. It wasn't until a patient of mine, a woman dying of lung cancer, told me something that I finally understood. She said, "Anger is just grief wearing a mask. When you're ready to take off the mask, the tears will come, and after the tears, the healing." I cried for 3 days straight after she died. 3 days of tears I had been holding back for years, and when I finally stopped, I felt lighter. Not happy. Grief doesn't work that way, but lighter. Like I had set down a burden I didn't even know I was carrying. I think you are carrying a burden, Victoria. I think you have been carrying it since your mother died and your father disappeared into his work. I think that burden has grown heavier with every year, every missed holiday, every phone call that didn't come. And I think that on the night of the gala, when you saw me wearing my mother's old dress and carrying my borrowed purse, something about my presence made that burden unbearable. I was not your enemy that night. I was just a woman who needed money she had been promised. But I think you saw something else when you looked at me. Maybe you saw everything you wished you could have been for your father. Maybe you saw the relationship you never had and knew you would never have now that he was gone. I don't know. I can only guess. What I do know is this. Your father loved you. He loved you imperfectly, inadequately, in ways that caused you real harm. But the love was there underneath all the work and the absence and the emotional unavailability. He talked about you in his final days. He kept your photograph by his bed. He died hoping that someday you would understand. I cannot tell you how to heal the wound between you and a father who is no longer here to make amends. That is work only you can do, probably with the help of a good therapist and a lot of time. But I can tell you that it is possible, that people survive these kinds of losses and come out the other side transformed, that the anger doesn't have to be the end of the story. I'm not asking you to apologize to me. I'm not sure I'm ready to hear it yet, and I'm not sure you're ready to offer it. But I'm asking you to consider something. The woman you were at that gala, cruel, cutting, desperate to hurt someone weaker than yourself, is that who you want to be? Is that the legacy you want to leave behind? Your father built buildings that will stand for 100 years. What are you building, Victoria? What will remain when you are gone? I don't expect a response to this letter. I don't even know if you will read it. But I needed to write it for my own peace of mind, if nothing else. I needed to say these things out loud, even if out loud is just ink on paper. Take care of yourself. And if you ever find the courage to take off the mask, know that the tears will come. And after the tears, the healing. Margaret Sullivan. She set down the pen and read through what she had written. It wasn't perfect. Some of the sentences were clumsy, and she wasn't sure about the part comparing Victoria's legacy to Harold's buildings. But it was honest. It was true, and that was all she could offer. Margaret folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and wrote Victoria's name on the front. She would mail it this afternoon on her way to the bridal shop where Sarah was having her final dress fitting. The phone rang just as she was putting on her coat. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. "Mom, are you on your way? I'm so nervous I could throw up. What if it doesn't fit? What if I look terrible?" Margaret smiled at her daughter's anxiety. "You will look beautiful. You always look beautiful. And if the dress doesn't fit, we will find another dress. That's the wonderful thing about problems, sweetheart. They almost always have solutions." "You sound different," Sarah said after a pause. "Lighter somehow. Did something happen?" "I wrote a letter to someone I needed to forgive. The woman from the party, the one Richard told me about?" Margaret had filled Sarah in on everything during a long phone call the week after the gala. Her daughter had been appropriately outraged, then appropriately amazed by Harold's gift, then inappropriately curious about Richard Calloway and whether he was single and whether Margaret had noticed how handsome he was. "Yes, the woman from the party. I don't know if she'll read it or if it will make any difference, but I feel better for having written it. That's what matters, Mom." Sarah's voice was warm. "Dad always said that forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of carrying anger around." Jim's words, coming back to her through their daughter's voice. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. "Your father was a wise man. He learned it from you. Now get in your new car and come watch me. Try on an overpriced white dress that I'm going to wear for exactly 1 day of my life." Margaret laughed. "I'm on my way." She mailed the letter at the post office downtown, watching the envelope disappear into the blue box with a mixture of relief and apprehension. It was done now. Whatever happened next was out of her hands. The bridal shop was in one of the nicer parts of the city, the kind of neighborhood where Margaret had always felt out of place. But today, walking through the door with Sarah rushing to greet her, she felt something she hadn't expected: belonging. Not because of the money in her bank account, but because of the love waiting for her inside. Sarah looked radiant in her wedding dress. Simple, elegant, with delicate lace sleeves and a train that whispered across the floor when she walked. She turned in front of the mirror, watching the fabric catch the light, and her eyes met Margaret's in the reflection. "What do you think?" Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by the sight of her little girl, her baby, her miracle, the child she had raised alone through poverty and grief and endless night shifts, standing there in white, about to start a new chapter of her life. "I think your father would be so proud," she managed. "I think he's watching right now somewhere, and he's crying just like I am." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She stepped down from the platform and wrapped her arms around her mother, careful not to crush the delicate dress. "I love you, Mum. Everything I am is because of you." "No, sweetheart." Margaret held her daughter tight, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, feeling the heartbeat that had once been inside her own body. "Everything you are is because of you. I just did my best to get out of the way." They stood like that for a long moment, mother and daughter, past and future, grief and joy intertwined in a single embrace. When they finally separated, the seamstress was discreetly wiping her own eyes. "This is what I love about this job," she said softly. "The dresses are beautiful, but the love is what makes it all worthwhile." Margaret thought about that statement as she drove home later that afternoon, the image of Sarah in white still burning bright in her mind. The love is what makes it all worthwhile. It was true for weddings. It was true for caregiving. It was true for life itself. She wondered if Victoria Ashford had ever experienced that kind of love, the kind that didn't ask for anything in return, the kind that showed up in the dark and stayed until dawn. Somewhere across the city, the letter Margaret had written was making its way through the postal system, carrying words that might change everything or might change nothing at all. But Margaret had done what she could do. She had extended grace where grace was not deserved. The rest was up to Victoria. The wedding was everything Sarah had dreamed of, and nothing like Margaret had imagined she would ever be able to provide. The ceremony took place in a small stone chapel on the outskirts of Seattle, surrounded by towering evergreens that swayed gently in the spring breeze. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting the wooden pews in shades of ruby and gold. White roses and baby's breath decorated the altar, their fragrance mixing with the old wood smell of a building that had witnessed a century of vows. Margaret sat in the front row, a tissue already crumpled in her hand, watching her daughter walk down the aisle on the arm of Richard Calloway. It had been Sarah's idea to ask him. "You need someone to walk you down the aisle," she had said during one of their planning sessions, "and Richard has been more of a father figure to you in the past 2 months than anyone since Dad died." Margaret had protested at first. It seemed like too much to ask of a man she barely knew, but Richard had accepted immediately when Sarah called him. "It would be my honor," he had said, his voice thick with emotion. "Harold would have wanted me to be there for your family." Now, watching them walk toward the altar, Margaret felt the tears she had been holding back finally spill over. Sarah was radiant in her simple white gown, her face glowing with the particular joy of a woman about to marry the love of her life. And Richard, in his perfectly tailored suit, looked proud and protective, exactly the way Jim would have looked if he had lived to see this day. The ceremony was brief but beautiful. Vows were exchanged, rings were placed on trembling fingers, and when the minister finally said, "You may kiss the bride," the chapel erupted in applause and joyful tears. Afterward, at the reception in a nearby vineyard, Margaret found herself standing alone on a terrace overlooking rows of grapevines stretching toward the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and for a moment she let herself simply breathe. Beautiful, isn't it? She turned to find Richard beside her, 2 glasses of champagne in his hands. "I thought you might need this," he said, offering her one. "Thank you for the champagne and for everything today. Walking Sarah down the aisle meant more to her than you know. It meant more to me than you know." Richard stood beside her, gazing out at the sunset. "I never had children of my own. My wife and I tried for years, but it wasn't meant to be. She passed about 10 years ago. Cancer, same as your Jim. I'm sorry, I didn't know. It's not something I talk about often, but today, walking Sarah down that aisle, I felt something I haven't felt in a long time, like I was part of a family again." Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering his words. Harold really did choose his friends well. He chose you too, in his own way. He saw something in you that he recognized. Goodness. Genuine, uncomplicated goodness. It's rarer than people think. Before Margaret could respond, a staff member approached with an envelope in her hand. "Excuse me, Mrs. Sullivan? This was left for you at the front desk. The woman who dropped it off said it was urgent." Margaret took the envelope with a puzzled frown. Her name was written on the front in elegant handwriting she didn't recognize. She tore it open and pulled out a single sheet of expensive stationery. "Dear Margaret, I received your letter 3 weeks ago. I have read it 47 times. For the first week, I was angry. How dare you presume to understand my pain? How dare you offer me advice on healing when you were the one who took my father's final moments from me? The second week, I was defensive. I made excuses for my behavior at the gala. I told myself you deserved what you got for showing up where you didn't belong, for accepting money that should have stayed in the family, for being everything I should have been but wasn't. The third week, something broke. I was sitting in my father's study going through his papers when I found a box of letters he had written, but never sent. Letters to me, Margaret. Dozens of them spanning 20 years. Letters apologizing for missing my graduation. Letters explaining why he worked so hard. Letters telling me about his childhood, his fears, his regrets. Letters saying he loved me but didn't know how to show it. He never sent them. He wrote them and put them in a box and locked them away, just like he locked away everything else he felt. And I realized reading those letters that my father and I were exactly the same. Both of us full of love we didn't know how to express. Both of us hiding behind walls we had built so high we forgot there was anything on the other side. You were right about the mask, Margaret. You were right about the tears. I've been crying for 3 days and I don't know if I will ever stop, but I also don't want to stop, because these tears feel like something leaving my body that needed to leave a long time ago. I am not writing to apologize. Not yet. I know that apologies require more than words. They require changed behavior, sustained over time. I am not ready to promise that yet because I don't know who I will be on the other side of this grief, but I am writing to say thank you for the letter, for the words about my father's love, for the truth that no one else had the courage to tell me. I found out that your daughter is getting married today. One of the staff at the facility mentioned it when I called to ask about you. I hope the wedding is beautiful. I hope she knows how lucky she is to have a mother like you. Maybe someday, when enough time has passed and enough tears have been shed, I will find the courage to say these things to your face. Until then, please know that your letter did not fall on deaf ears. It fell on a broken heart that is finally starting to mend. Victoria Ashford. Margaret read the letter twice, then pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes. Good news? Richard asked gently. The best news. She handed him the letter and watched his face as he read it. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Harold would be so happy, he said quietly. This is what he wanted more than anything, for Victoria to find her way back to herself. It's not over yet. She has a long road ahead of her. But she started walking it. That's the hardest part, taking the first step. Margaret looked out at the vineyard, where the last rays of sunlight were fading into purple twilight. Somewhere inside the reception hall, Sarah was dancing with her new husband, surrounded by friends and family who loved her. Somewhere across the country, Victoria Ashford was sitting with her father's unsent letters, learning who he really was for the first time. And here on this terrace, Margaret Sullivan, caregiver, widow, mother, holder of hands in the dark, finally understood something she had been struggling to articulate for weeks. You know what I've learned from all of this? She said to Richard. Tell me. I've learned that we never really know the full story of anyone's life, not our patients, not our families, not even ourselves. We see fragments, pieces, moments frozen in time, and we make judgments based on those fragments without understanding the whole picture. She turned to face him fully. Victoria saw me as the woman who stole her father's last moments. I saw her as a cruel, heartless socialite who didn't deserve her father's love. Harold saw himself as a failure who had ruined his relationship with his only child. We were all wrong, Richard. We were all looking at fragments and thinking we understood the whole. Richard nodded slowly. So what's the answer? If we can't trust our own perceptions, how do we navigate the world? Grace, Margaret said simply. We extend grace to others because we know we need it ourselves. We forgive because we know we will someday need forgiveness. We show kindness because kindness is the only thing that breaks through the walls we build around our hearts. She thought of Harold's letters, locked in a box for 20 years, of Victoria's anger hardening into cruelty, of her own rage after Jim's death, poisoning her from the inside. We all carry wounds, she continued. Every single person we meet is fighting battles we know nothing about. The checkout clerk who seems rude might have just received a devastating diagnosis. The driver who cuts us off might be racing to a hospital where a loved one is dying. The woman who humiliates us at a party might be drowning in grief she has never learned to process. That doesn't excuse bad behavior. No, it doesn't, but it explains it. And when we understand, truly understand that everyone is struggling, it becomes harder to hate them, harder to judge, easier to offer the grace we all desperately need. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he raised his champagne glass. To Grace, he said. To Grace, Margaret echoed. They touched glasses as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Later that night, after the last dance had been danced and the last toast had been made, Margaret found Sarah alone in the bridal suite, still wearing her wedding dress. Shouldn't you be with your husband? Margaret teased. He'll wait. I wanted a moment with you first. Sarah took her mother's hands. Thank you, Mom, for everything, for raising me alone when Dad died, for working all those night shifts so I could go to college, for never giving up even when I'm sure you wanted to. I never wanted to give up. You were my reason for getting up every morning. And you were mine." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I know it wasn't easy. I know there were times when you didn't know how you were going to pay the bills or put food on the table, but you never let me see that. You protected me from the hard parts and showed me the beautiful ones. That's what mothers do." "No." Sarah shook her head firmly. "That's what you do, and I want you to know that I see it. I see you, not just as my mother, but as a woman who has lived an extraordinary life. A woman who has touched hundreds of lives with her kindness. A woman who, even when she was humiliated and hurt, responded with grace." Margaret pulled her daughter into a fierce embrace. "I love you," she whispered, "more than you will ever know." "I know exactly how much," Sarah whispered back, "because I love you the same way." They held each other as the moon rose over the vineyard, two women bound by blood and love and the unbreakable thread of family, and Margaret finally understood that this was her legacy. Not money or buildings or social status, but love passed down from generation to generation, kindness modeled daily in 1,000 small actions, grace extended even when it cost something to give. These were the things that mattered. These were the things that lasted. These were the things that made a life worth living. She had been invisible for most of her years on this earth. The help, the caregiver, the woman in the background, but she had never been insignificant. Every hand she had held, every hymn she had sung, every patient she had comforted in their final hours, all of it mattered. All of it rippled outward in ways she would never fully see. Margaret Sullivan, the caregiver from the night shift, had changed the world, one act of kindness at a time.